Hello everybody and welcome to Every Movie Ever. I'm your host Eric and this is the show where we are reviewing every movie ever made, starting today with The Client. Now this is one of those, it's a legal thriller. It's a 90s legal thriller. And I am certainly a big fan of courtroom dramas. Now The Client isn't really a courtroom drama. What it is a story about a little kid who witnesses a murder and then becomes caught up in a thing where the federal attorneys want him and then the mob wants him and all of that kind of thing. And then he ends up hooking up with a lawyer played by Susan Sarandon, a tough, straight-talking lawyer-type character. Again, not a lot happens in the courtroom in this one. This is more about the intrigue surrounding the lead-up to the case. And the movie, I'd never seen it. I was excited to check it out. Anytime, one of these big, I realize that I haven't seen one of these kind of bigger movies from the 80s or 90s, I'm always interested to check it out. And this one does start strong, but quickly loses steam. As the movie goes on, I just found myself becoming less and less interested in what was going on, in no small part because the main character kid pretty quickly becomes annoying. The Client, 2.5 stars. Up next, let's talk about Carol, a movie from a year or two ago now that when it popped up on the online streaming services, I was excited to finally get the opportunity to watch it. This is the one that stars Cate Blanchett as a homosexual woman living in the 1950s and her budding romance with a shop girl played by Rooney Mara, who is just discovering her own sexuality. Cate Blanchett, meanwhile, is married to a rich dude and has a daughter and is trying to navigate all of that as well as the realities of having the feelings that she has in that time and that place. Carol is a moving romance. And it's interesting to see the dichotomy of these two characters' stories as Rooney discovers herself and Cate Blanchett, who already knows who she is, fights to be who she is. It's a compelling movie and extremely well acted. I don't have a ton more to say about it other than just to say once again that I did find it particularly moving and interesting. Carol, 4 stars. Now it's time for MST3 A to Z. This is, of course, the part of the show where we are going back through the Mystery Science Theater 3000 catalog and watching all of the movies they watched in alphabetical order, because I am a hopeless dork. And today, that is going to mean taking a look at the Corpse Vanishes, a lesser work featuring the great old-time monster movie actor Bela Lugosi. This is from later on in Bela's career. Bela, if you don't know, had a particularly hard career. Even though he hit big with his first picture in Dracula, he had a hard time keeping consistent high-level work, both because of his own personality and because of the attitudes of the studios toward him. The Corpse Vanishes is, like I say, one of his later pictures. He fell into a pattern of working on very low-budget sort of horror monster movies because he just wanted to keep working. And this is certainly one of those, with Lugosi very much in the sort of mad scientist role, in this case abducting dead bodies. It's a somewhat intriguing premise. I particularly like that there's a sort of a female newspaper reporter on his trail, but the whole thing never quite works and is pretty boring, which is why I'm giving The Corpse Vanishes 1 star. Now it's time for Calling All Horror Hounds. This week on Horror Hounds, we've got a pretty big one because it's about time we got around to talking about Dawn of the Dead. Directed by George Romero, the man who very much invented the zombies as we think of them today. Previously, zombies had been sort of brainwashed creatures in voodoo ritual. George Romero, in his movie Night of the Living Dead, invented the idea of the undead brain eaters and the shuffling hordes as we know them today. Dawn of the Dead is Romero's follow-up to Night of the Living Dead. This is the one where 4 or 5 survivors of the zombie apocalypse have hunkered down in a mall. And it's a terrific movie. The effects are maybe not always there. The makeup effects by Tom Savini are pretty, there's a lot of great stuff in here. There's a part where the top of his head gets lopped off by a helicopter blade, and that's pretty good. Any of the gore is great. What kind of doesn't work is Savini, his habit of making the zombies up in this sort of, this sort of slate gray makeup that kind of doesn't quite work for me. But the rest of the movie is terrific. Like I said, this has to do with a bunch of survivors holing up in a mall, which is a premise that I think is, just tremendous, both in terms of relatability and of satire. As far as relatability goes, this idea of thinking that first off, the idea of thinking that you can survive the zombie apocalypse is universal. And there are a ton of movies about this very notion, and it's certainly become a trend among dorks and hipsters to talk about their zombie survival plan. And this movie is the very first zombie survival plan. And living in the mall sounds pretty good. Here there's, you spend a lot of time watching them block off the entrances and figure things out, and then they have the whole mall to get, clothes and entertainment. They somehow maintain a constant stream of food and electricity, which is a thing I'm not real sure how they're able to do, but, so be it. And certainly in watching the movie, I find myself very swept up in that scenario and imagining how I would, thinking about the malls around me and figuring out how I would try and survive in them and the feasibility of that. It is pretty dorky. And then as far as the satirical thing goes, it's a lot of fun to see these zombies who are at the mall, sort of, even though they're dead, falling into these patterns they had in life. And, so seeing them shuffle around the mall trying to go to stores before our heroes are able to kind of clean them out of the mall. And, so it's that sort of satire of consumerism and mindless consumerism that, now I think feels a little bit obvious, but only because he did it here so well, because this is obviously the first time it was done. It's one of those ideas that is so genius that when you see it, it seems obvious in a way. Of course, the movie is ultimately about, as most of these zombie movies are, the inevitability of death. Ultimately, the zombies are gonna overrun the mall. And the boredom of modern life, because our heroes quickly find themselves bored with the life they've constructed for themselves in this mall, that surviving is sort of not enough, and that the pleasures given by a shopping mall are somewhat hollow. It is a viscerally entertaining movie as a horror film, but it is also very intellectually stimulating and interesting, and with a wicked sense of humor. Dawn of the Dead, 4 stars. Let's stick around with horror hounds for a minute and talk about Romero's follow-up to Dawn of the Dead. That's Day of the Dead. Now, I'm going to talk to you right here at the top in saying that Day of the Dead, I think, is more or less on par with Dawn of the Dead. I think that they both have their they're sort of on equal par in terms of what they do right and what they do right, which is a lot, and what they do wrong, which is not quite so much. For Day of the Dead, rather, this one takes place a few years later, a whole new set of characters, because of course pretty much all of our characters in Dawn of the Dead got dead by the end of the movie. So now we have a whole new group of people. These ones are in an underground military bunker, and you got a group of scientists who are trying to find a cure for the zombie plague, and a group of soldiers who are sort of sick of sitting around with nothing to shoot. What Day of the Dead does right is I think it does have a little bit better effects. Savini's back, still doing great makeup work, but this time he's not, quite shellacking on that same odd gray pallor. And so in addition to the, good gore effects, the zombies themselves look pretty great. In particular, our main zombie, I'm trying to remember his name. I want to say it's Bud. I apologize if I'm wrong. I know I'm going to get a lot of comments. But he looks great. And he's a great character too, as he's this zombie that they've sort of cordoned off and are trying to train to do simple tasks and to talk again and things like that. What it does wrong is that it's maybe not quite as arresting to me as Dawn of the Dead. Dawn of the Dead is so sympathetic because that situation of the characters in the mall is so universal. Whereas this sort of military situation, while understandable and somewhat relatable, isn't quite as intimately relatable as Dawn of the Dead is to me. So this one's not quite as arresting. It's a darker movie in many ways, in part, and the satire is now focused on the military-industrial complex as opposed to consumerism. So that said, Romero is still, holding on fiercely to that thread that connects all of his Dead movies of using the zombie apocalypse to turn an eye on what is not quite right about our own society. And like I say here, it's that military industrial complex. The other darkness of this is that in Dawn of the Dead, the movie starts with people still out in the world, and the zombies are still sort of a new thing. There's this sense of that the world is still grappling with the zombie hordes, whereas in Day of the Dead, we talked about in Dawn of the Dead, the inevitability of death being a part of it. In Day of the Dead, the world is already over. The zombies on top have already won, and it's just and so there's still, inevitability isn't quite the right word, because like I say, it's something more than inevitability. It's maybe destiny at this point. The zombies are the masters of the earth, and now instead of people on the run, now it's the last people in a corner. Day of the Dead, 4 stars. Now let's head over to the animation station. This week's animation station, it's time we checked out Wreck-It Ralph. With the new Wreck-It Ralph movie recently in theaters, it was time to revisit this one. And this is one I've revisited quite a few times since I first saw it. If you're not familiar, what they've done is they've sort of done Toy Story but with video games. So in an arcade at night, all the video game characters come to life and meet up within the video games and hang out and talk to each other. The movie follows Wreck-It Ralph, who is a sort of Donkey Kong-esque character in that he's the villain of an old-timesy video game who throws things at our hero, in this case, Fix-It Felix Jr., taking the place of Donkey Kong's Mario. So Wreck-It Ralph is the villain, and the movie is about how Ralph is tired of being the villain. He's tired of being ostracized. He's not a bad guy. That's just his job. He's almost as if he's an actor playing the part of a villain in a video game, and he's tired of the other characters in his game and others treating him as a bad guy. Wreck-It Ralph, played by John C. Reilly to tremendous effect here. John C. Reilly is really a tremendous actor. I think to a lot of people he's best known for his collaborations with Will Ferrell, and with good reason. They're hilarious. But it's sometimes easy to forget a little bit that, oh yeah, this guy is also a serious actor with like Oscar nominations, who certainly first came onto my radar for his emotional turns in movies like Chicago. And I want to say, and I think he's in like The Hours or something like that. He's a tremendous, tremendous actor, and he brings a lot of not just humor, but also pathos to his role as Ralph. He then goes to another game, a racing game, a candy-themed racing game, where he meets Vanellope von Schweetz, a small, cute character played by Sarah Silverman, the terrific comedian. And they form a bond that allows Ralph to realize that, that he is who he is, and he doesn't need to put quite so much stock in what other people think of him, and that they'll come around and that sort of stuff. Vanellope gives him the chance to be the hero of his own story in what ends up being a tremendously touching movie, especially for a movie that sounds at first blush like it's a little bit of a Toy Story knockoff. They are able to forge a movie that is its own movie, that stands on its own 2 feet and has a lot of real emotional resonance. Like I said, this is one I find myself revisiting pretty often. It's a really terrific movie. Wreck-It Ralph, 4 stars. Now it's time for a Hollywood classic. This week's Hollywood classic is the Western staple High Noon. This one stars Gary Cooper as a retiring town sheriff who has to pick up his badge once more immediately after marrying his lady friend to try and defend the town from a group of baddies, and he goes around town trying to find people to form a posse with him, and nobody will agree to help him. Grace Kelly plays the female lead in this. She's the woman that has just married Gary Cooper, and this is a movie that, it's like I say, it's considered a Western classic, but I have to be honest, I only find it serviceable. This is not the first time I had seen this movie. I'd seen it before years ago, and it didn't really hit home with me then. It doesn't really hit home with me now. I'm not quite sure. I mean, it's not that I don't like Westerns. I certainly do. And while I tend to gravitate more toward Sergio Leone-style spaghetti Westerns, there are a lot of classic Hollywood Westerns that are not so far from this that I do love, such as the Legend of Liberty Valance. That said, you know, like I say, High Noon just doesn't quite click for me. I'm not really sure why. It is a movie that, looking back at it, is sort of an allegory for HUAC and the communist trials, and is revolutionary for its time in that it eschews standard, you know, Western storytelling tropes about, you know, like the town coming together and the sheriff, you know, maybe not needing help because he's such a strong force for good and all of that. But now it feels a bit staid, and it's not quite something I can relate to. I feel like the mythology around it is much more interesting than the movie itself. This idea that it was very much written as that HUAC allegory, with Gary Cooper standing in as sort of the, you know, wrongfully accused person who is just looking for help from his neighbors to do the right thing, and none of them are willing to do it. So while that's interesting, it doesn't quite play on the screen so much for me, so I'm only giving High Noon 3 stars. Now it's time for nobody's favorite part of the show. This is the worst of the week. This week's worst of the week is Home Again, a recent Reese Witherspoon feature that I was quite looking forward to checking out. I enjoy Reese Witherspoon, particularly after seeing her in Big Little Lies. Man, what a job she does in that movie. Reese Witherspoon is a relatable and enjoyable, and, you know, she's a terrific actress, and she has that star quality. So you want to see movies with her in them. Home Again, however, is not that movie. It is a confusing movie with a confusing premise that involves a recently divorced Reese Witherspoon allowing a group of screenwriters, much younger screenwriters, to move into her house with her and her daughter. It's a very strange movie. Part of why it doesn't work is that it's very inside baseball. It's very much a movie about the film industry, with a lot of time spent on these screenwriters who are like hot shots off of some sort of festival circuit trying to sell their first feature. Now, this is a thing that I kind of know things about, and that I understand, you know, pretty well, but these movies drive me nuts. There's been this whole spate lately of movies and TV shows wherein the job of the main characters is some like real deep entertainment industry job. And sometimes I enjoy these shows. A recent one would be Crashing, the HBO show with Pete Holmes. But a lot of the times it doesn't work at all, like that recent show that starred Will Arnett and Christina Applegate, where they're new parents, but for some reason she's the producer of an Oprah-style show. I feel like a lot of times these movies and TV shows create a real distance with the audience. You know, what happened to shows, just as an example, like a Cheers, or even more recently The Office, where people had regular and relatable jobs? There's this whole big trend toward entertainment industry jobs that I understand why you're doing them, because the people that write them are in the entertainment industry, and it's what they can relate to and what they think is interesting. But that I think to most of America is, like I say, creating that distance that is really holding these premises back. Now, Home Again isn't just held back by that. It's also just a weird and confusing and broken movie. And a big part of it is because it seems like it's two movies slammed together. Because Reese Witherspoon, now I'm not going to say Reese Witherspoon is too old. I think that's insulting. but I do think that her co-stars are too young. Why not make them more age appropriate? And this is a thing I think should work both ways. I would not like it any better if it was an older guy actor with younger women screenwriters. Let's just try and get some age appropriate pairings going on in some of these movies. The other fault of it is that you've got the Reese Witherspoon story, flirting with what is essentially a feature-length episode of Entourage, where you have these jerky screenwriter guys living in her house and trying to romance her, and also trying to take care of her because they're men in a weird way. It's a movie that does not work at all. It is a real shame. 1.5 stars. Now it's time for the best of the bunch. This week's best of the bunch is certainly a movie I had seen before when it was originally out in theaters, and a movie that I enjoyed at that time, but I think that I undervalued it and that I continue to do so, and that movie is Lincoln. This is Steven Spielberg's big budget movie about Lincoln during the waning days of the American Civil War, featuring an absolutely tremendous performance from Daniel Day-Lewis as Abraham Lincoln. Now, we've talked about DDL on the show before, and he is possibly his generation's greatest actor. He is certainly an actor who, unlike a lot of actors, really disappears into his part. We talked on the show not that long ago about Phantom Thread, and looking at the character he played, Reynolds Woodcock, the character he plays in Phantom Thread, and then looking at Abraham Lincoln and looking at other characters like Bill the Butcher in Gangs of New York, it is almost unfathomable that this is the same actor. Especially when you look at something like Gangs of New York, where Daniel Day-Lewis is playing this very broad and violent character. To watch him play Lincoln as this, sort of shy and understated person it's a little bit of magic. Like I say, I think I've underrated this movie a bit in the past, and I'm not sure why. I think in a lot of ways it confounded my expectations. It's interesting that the movie is called Lincoln, and yet it's a movie that focuses on a very particular and short window of time in America, and a particular event, not even really the Civil War, but the attempts by Lincoln and his like-minded Republican senators to pass the amendment declaring emancipation for the slaves. And it's all about that. It's all about rounding up the votes. That's what this movie is about. Whereas a movie called Lincoln, I think, makes you think that it's going to be a movie that's all about Abe Lincoln and his life. This is a movie wherein Lincoln is arguably the main character, but hardly the only character. As the movie also spends a good amount of time with Mary Todd Lincoln, with their son Robert Todd Lincoln, played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who's a dude who just wants to go to war. But Abe won't let him go because they already lost one son and another would maybe destroy poor old Mary Todd. I hear Mary Todd a-calling. Anyway. It also focuses on David Strahan as a guy, I forget what his job is exactly, who's trying to whip up the votes in the Senate, as well as this group of sort of ne'er-do-wells that he recruits to do the dirty work of convincing the senators to make the vote. It is a stirring and inspiring movie that really impressively captures a moment in history. The production design is second to none. The sets and the costumes, you feel like you're there and you get a real sense of what Washington must have been like at that time. And in that same vein where I really like courtroom dramas, these movies about sort of political machinations also really get me going. In a weird and stupid way, I guess I would have maybe liked this movie originally more if it had a different title. I do continue to think that Lincoln is maybe a little bit of a misleading title. Maybe a title like Emancipation or something would have been more suited to, like I say, this very specific moment in the career of one of our greatest presidents. Still, watching it this time, I really came around to just how tremendous a piece of filmmaking this is. Lincoln, 4.5 stars. So that is going to do it for this episode of Every Movie Ever. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time as we keep trying to review every movie ever made. And don't forget to visit our website, northmetrotv.com/everymovieever. There, you can watch reviews of every movie we've ever covered here on the show, as well as complete episodes. That's northmetrotv.com/everymovieever.